Greetings and salutations, my fellow Americans. I am Robert Vincent Brannum. I am a retired veteran. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans. Once again, Donald Trump has spoken the truth about himself. Donald Trump's comments before the Black Conservative Federation in South Carolina showed beyond a doubt and contestation Donald Trump is and always has been a racist and a bigot. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, Donald Trump has already been found liable for sexually assaulting a woman, has been accused of rape, determined in a court of law to be a fraud and not credible as a witness. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, Donald Trump is a clear present and future danger to the Constitution and a menace to democracy. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, Donald Trump is a fighter only for himself, not for peace, justice, equality, freedom, truth, or for you as Americans. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, my fellow Black Americans, Donald Trump's life in business and politics is premised on racism and bigotry. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, just because the media says Americans do not want a rematch between Donald Trump and President Joe Biden does not mean Americans do not want Joe Biden reelected. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, Donald Trump has frightened and bullied many in the media to be silent about Donald Trump's and extreme far right wing MAGA Republicans' political brand of racism and bigotry. Over the primary elections in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, the media has overhyped Donald Trump's wins over his opponents while minimizing President Joe Biden's victories over his opponents and rumored third party candidates. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, Donald Trump's economic policies will ruin the nation. Donald Trump's foreign policies will endanger the nation before the eyes of the world and release the sovereignty of America's allies to Russia, China, and North Korea. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, my fellow Black Americans, the vision of Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans can be visualized through despair, despotism, and demagoguery. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, Donald Trump and MAGA social media posters are violent and vulgar, and they are proud of what they say and what they do. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, my fellow Black Americans, do not forget or ignore the real Donald Trump, an accused rapist, a racist, found liable for sexually assaulting women, determined in a court of law to be a fraud, and a liar. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, my fellow Black Americans, as an American, as a veteran, and as a Black man, it is disgusting. There are MAGA Republicans in media, among social media, and among congressional Republicans embracing Donald Trump's racism, bigotry, and seek to reward him with the Republican Party's nomination and the chair in the Oval Office. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, do not be afraid to take a stand against Donald Trump's lies, his racism, his bigotry, and words in support of white supremacy, violence, and vulgarity. Do not be afraid or ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, are we a nation willing to sacrifice the Constitution, democracy, freedom, justice, and truth to keep Donald Trump out of jail and to vote against the best interests of a free America? I say no to Donald Trump and yes to President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, my fellow Black Americans, the idea of Donald Trump becoming president again is not good news for decency or democracy. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, my fellow Black Americans, just as it was decision time for the signers of the Declaration of Independence, President Abraham Lincoln, President Harry Truman, and President Lyndon Johnson. It is decision time for us as their legatees to democracy. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, we cannot go back. We cannot return. We cannot stand for an America of blatant racism and naked bigotry. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans understand the strength and power of democracy, justice, freedom, and truth. The reality is they don't want others to share its fruits. Rather, they embrace lies, racism, bigotry, and violence as proxies to control and divide. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, and my fellow Black Americans, do not accommodate Donald Trump's and MAGA Republicans' unethical brand of politics. Do not surrender to Donald Trump's and MAGA Republicans' evil repackaged nostalgia of slavery and segregation. My fellow Americans, my dear fellow veterans, and my dear fellow Black Americans, with God on our side, the Constitution, democracy, freedom, justice, decency, and truth can and will prevail against the darkness of Donald Trump and extreme far right wing MAGA Republicans, but only if we all take a stand and vote for righteousness. My fellow Americans, my fellow veterans, my fellow Black Americans, I love freedom. I love democracy. I wore dog tags. I have a DD 214. I have served my country. I walked the walk. My oath and belief never ends. Thank you.